You know what's funny about engine sound? We spend millions engineering these mechanical symphonies, and then we muffle them. We literally put mufflers on them. It's like commissioning Mozart and then making him play through a pillow. But every once in a while, an engine comes along that refuses to be silenced. An engine that sounds so good, so absolutely perfect, that even through catalytic converters and resonators and all the government-mandated sound deadening, it still makes grown adults giggle like children. Today we're talking about 10 American V8s that achieved something special. Not just power, not just performance, but that perfect combination of mechanical violence and acoustic beauty that makes you roll down the windows in a tunnel just to hear the echo. Let me ask you something. What makes an engine sound good? Is it displacement, cam profile, exhaust design? The answer is yes, all of it, everything. It's this perfect storm of engineering decisions that somehow, whether by accident or design, creates automotive music. And American engineers, well, they've been conducting this orchestra for over a century now. Sometimes they nail it. Sometimes they create something that sounds like a garbage disposal eating another garbage disposal. But when they get it right, oh man, when they get it right. The thing is, engine sound tells a story. You can hear the compression ratio in the snap of the exhaust. You can hear the cam duration in the idle lope. You can literally hear the engineering. And American V8s, they've always been storytellers. From the flathead Ford that powered bootleggers to the modern flat-plane screamers that embarrass European exotics, each generation has its voice. Today we're ranking the best of the best, the engines that didn't just move metal, they moved souls. Starting at number 10, we have the AMC 401. Never heard of it? Yeah, that's what AMC said when they looked at their market share too. But here's the thing about being the underdog. You've got nothing to lose, so you might as well make something special. The 401 was AMC's biggest production V8, and it had this uneven, deep rumble that was completely unique. Not smooth like a Cadillac, not angry like a Hemi, but somewhere in between. Like a bear that's annoyed but not quite angry yet. AMC built this engine from 1971 to 1978, and it powered everything from Javelins to Jeep Wagoneers. The sound came from its unique firing order and the fact that AMC, being cash-strapped as always, used different exhaust manifold designs than the big three. The result was this distinctive burble at idle that turned into a muscular bellow under load. You could identify an AMC 401 from 3 blocks away. Not because it was loud, but because it sounded different. In a world of small block Chevys and Windsor Fords, different was good. What really made the 401 special was its torque delivery. This thing made 430 lb-ft at just 3,300 RPM. That's diesel territory. And you could hear it in the exhaust note. Deep, guttural, almost industrial. It wasn't trying to be a race engine. It wasn't pretending to be something it wasn't. It was honest horsepower from America's most honest car company. The fact that AMC went bankrupt doesn't diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes it more poignant. This was their swan song, and what a song it was. Moving up to number 9, the Cadillac 500 cubic inch V8. If the AMC 401 was a bear, the Cadillac 500 was a grizzly in a tuxedo. Smooth, sophisticated, but with enough displacement to alter local weather patterns. This engine powered Eldorados and Fleetwoods from 1970 to 1976, and it remains one of the largest production V8s ever built. 500 cubic inches. That's 8.2 liters for you metric folks. That's bigger than most modern truck engines. The Cadillac 500 didn't sound angry. It sounded inevitable, like tectonic plates shifting. At idle, it produced this bass-heavy rumble that you felt more than heard. The kind of sound that made windows rattle 3 cars away at a stoplight. But the genius was in the refinement. Cadillac engineers spent countless hours tuning the exhaust note to be powerful, but not crude, muscular, but not uncouth. This was the engine for people who wanted to intimidate, not through volume, but through sheer presence. I once heard a properly tuned Cadillac 500 with headers and glass packs, and I swear I felt my chest cavity resonate. It's that frequency that gets you right in the solar plexus, the kind of sound that makes you understand why displacement matters. You can't fake cubic inches. You can turbocharge a four-cylinder to make the same power, sure, but it'll never sound like this. Never have that earthquake at idle quality that makes people stop and stare. The tragedy of the 500 is that it arrived just as the party was ending. By 1976, emissions regulations had choked it down to a mere 190 horsepower. 190 horsepower from 8.2 liters. That's criminal. That's like using a sledgehammer to drive thumbtacks. But even neutered, even strangled by catalytic converters and smog pumps, it still sounded magnificent. Because you can muffle thunder, but you can't make it whisper. Number 8 brings us to the Shelby GT350's 289 Hypo. Now, this is where things get interesting, because on paper, a 289 cubic inch V8 has no business being on a list with 427s and 454s. But Carroll Shelby understood something that most people miss. Size isn't everything. Sometimes it's about the scream. The 289 Hypo in the GT350 was basically a Windsor small block that had been to anger management and failed. Solid lifters, high compression, headers that were barely legal, and an exhaust system that was more suggestion than requirement. The result was this high-strung snarl that sounded nothing like a traditional American V8. It was nervous, anxious, ready to fight. At idle it had this choppy, uncertain quality, like it might stall or explode. You weren't quite sure which. But crack the throttle, and suddenly everything made sense. The 289 Hypo didn't rumble, it shrieked. It had this perfect header crackle on deceleration that sounded like firecrackers going off in sequence. Pop, 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 pop. It was mechanical music. And because it was a small displacement engine spinning to 7,000 RPM, it had this urgency that big blocks couldn't match. Big blocks sound like they're working. The 289 Hypo sounded like it was escaping. What made the GT350's version special was the complete package. The side pipes, the lack of sound deadening, the aluminum intake that acted like an echo chamber. Everything was designed to make noise. Good noise, the right noise. Shelby once said that horsepower sells cars, but torque wins races. He was right, but he forgot to mention that sound sells dreams, and the 289 Hypo sold a lot of dreams. Number 7 is the Pontiac 421 Superduty, and if you've never heard one of these in person, you're missing out on one of the angriest sounds ever to come out of Detroit. The 421 SD was Pontiac's nuclear option in the early 1960s horsepower wars. While everyone else was building street engines that could race, Pontiac built a race engine that was barely street legal. The Superduty had this raspy, metallic quality that was completely different from other big blocks of the era. Part of it was the high compression, we're talking 12.1 or higher, which gave it this sharp, crisp exhaust note. Part of it was the solid lifter cam that had more duration than a Peter Jackson movie, but mostly it was the attitude. This engine was pissed off from the factory. At idle, a 421 Superduty sounded broken, seriously broken. The lope was so aggressive that people would walk up at gas stations and ask if you needed help. But mat the throttle, and suddenly that broken idle turned into this feral roar that sounded like someone chainsawing through steel. It was violent, it was antisocial, it was absolutely perfect. Pontiac only built the Superduty for a few years before GM's racing ban killed it. But in that short time, it established itself as one of the most fearsome engines ever to prowl the streets. The sound alone was worth the price of admission. This was an engine that announced your arrival 3 blocks before you got there, not through volume, though it had plenty of that, but through sheer mechanical aggression. Coming in at number 6, the Chevrolet LS7. Now I know what you're thinking. A modern engine on this list, but hear me out. The LS7 is proof that you can have your cake and eat it too. 7 liters of naturally aspirated, titanium-rotted, dry-sumped insanity that somehow passes emissions and gets decent gas mileage. It's like finding out your accountant has a black belt in karate. The LS7 sounds nothing like traditional small blocks because, well, it isn't one. Sure, it's based on the LS architecture, but with 427 cubic inches, it's knocking on big block door. The sound is clean, almost clinical at low RPM, but there's this underlying violence, like a surgeon who might snap at any moment. The titanium rods give it a distinctly metallic quality, almost hollow, but in the best way possible. What really sets the LS7 apart is how it sounds at 7,000 RPM. Most big displacement engines are done by 6,000. They're out of breath, valves floating, ready to scatter connecting rods like confetti. The LS7 is just getting started. It pulls cleanly to 7 grand, and sounds like it wants more. It's this perfect blend of old-school displacement and new-school engineering. NASCAR thunder with Formula One precision. The LS7 in the Z06 Corvette came with a dual-mode exhaust that let you choose between neighbor-friendly and wake the dead. In quiet mode, it was surprisingly civil. Hit the button, though, and butterflies in the exhaust would open up, unleashing one of the best sounds to come out of Detroit in the 21st century. It's proof that emissions regulations didn't kill the V8 sound. They just made engineers work harder. Number 5. The Chevrolet 454 LS6. The last of the old-school big blocks. The final answer to the question nobody was asking anymore. How much power can we make with no regard for fuel economy, emissions, or common sense? The answer was 450 horsepower and 500 lb-ft of torque in 1970. Those are decent numbers today. In 1970, they were absolutely ridiculous. The 454 LS6 sounded exactly like what it was. Too much displacement, too much compression, too much cam. At idle, it had this lumpy, uneven quality that made the whole car shake. Not vibrate, shake. Like someone was hitting the frame with a sledgehammer every time a cylinder fired. The exhaust note was pure thunder, deep, resonant. The kind of sound that triggered car alarms before car alarms were even a thing. But the real magic happened when you opened it up. The 454 LS6 had this unique ability to sound smooth and violent at the same time. It was like controlled chaos. The exhaust note would clean up as the revs climbed, but it never lost that underlying brutality. It always sounded like it might explode, but in a good way, like fireworks. Beautiful destruction. Chevrolet only built the LS6 for 1 year, 1970. That's it. Compression ratios dropped after that. Horsepower ratings went to net instead of gross, and suddenly the muscle car era was over. The LS6 was the exclamation point at the end of the sentence, the mic drop, the last hurrah. And what a hurrah it was. Even today, 50 years later, a properly tuned 454 LS6 is one of the most intimidating sounds in all of automobile dom. Number 4 is where things get exotic. The Ford 5.2-liter Voodoo flat-plane V8. When Ford announced they were putting a flat-plane crank V8 in the Mustang GT350, the internet lost its collective mind. Flat-plane cranks were for Ferraris and race cars, not Mustangs. But Ford did it anyway, and the result was one of the most unique-sounding engines ever to wear a blue oval. The Voodoo doesn't sound like an American V8. It sounds like an American V8 that went to finishing school in Italy. At idle, it's surprisingly smooth, almost European. But crack the throttle, and it transforms into this shrieking, wailing banshee that sounds nothing like anything else from Detroit. It's the difference between a sledgehammer and a samurai sword. Both are weapons, but one has more finesse. What makes the flat-plane crank special is the firing order. Instead of the traditional crossplane's uneven firing pattern that gives American V8s their characteristic burble, the flat plane fires evenly, like two 4-cylinders joined at the hip. The result is this smooth, almost turbine-like quality at high RPM. The Voodoo spins to 8,250 RPM, and it sounds glorious doing it. It's mechanical violence at its most refined. Ford engineers spent years getting the Voodoo to sound right. They tried different exhaust designs, different intake configurations, different everything. The final result was worth the effort. This is an engine that sounds expensive, because it was. It sounds special, because it is. In a world of turbochargers and displacement downsizing, the Voodoo is a middle finger to convention, a naturally aspirated, high-revving monster that sounds like nothing else on the road. The tragedy is that Ford killed the Voodoo after just a few years, replaced it with a supercharged crossplane in the GT500. More power, sure, but the sound? Not even close. The Voodoo was special precisely because it was different. It proved that American engineers could do finesse when they wanted to. We just usually don't want to. Number 3. The Dodge 426 Hemi, the elephant, the King Kong of muscle car engines. An engine so legendary that Chrysler has been trading on its reputation for 50 years. And you know what? It deserves every bit of that reputation. Because a properly tuned 426 Hemi sounds like the end of the world, and I mean that in the best possible way. The Hemi sound comes from its unique architecture. Those hemispherical combustion chambers that gave it its name also gave it a distinct acoustic signature. At idle, it has this deep, loping quality that sounds almost lazy, but it's deceptive, like a heavyweight boxer who looks slow until he throws a punch. The exhaust pulses are so distinct you can count them. Boom, boom, boom. Each one a small explosion. Under load, the Hemi transforms. That lazy idle becomes a crisp, thunderous roar that sounds like artillery fire. It's sharp, percussive, almost painful if you're standing too close. But it's also musical. There's a rhythm to it, a cadence that gets into your bones. You don't just hear a Hemi, you feel it, in your chest, in your teeth, in your soul. What really set the 426 apart was its presence. This wasn't just an engine, it was a statement. When a Hemi-powered car rolled up to the starting line, everyone knew the game had changed. The sound alone was worth a tenth in the quarter mile just from sheer intimidation. It sounded expensive because it was. It sounded fast because it was. It sounded mean because, well, it was. The 426 Hemi was only available from 1964 to 1971, but its legacy lives on. Modern Hemis share the name but not the architecture. They're good engines, but they don't have that raw mechanical violence of the original. The 426 was the last of the no-compromise race engines, built for one purpose, going fast and sounding good doing it. Number 2, the Chevrolet 427 ZL1. Aluminum everything, race-bred engineering, and a price tag that would make your mortgage look reasonable. The ZL1 was never meant for the street. It was a Can-Am race engine that somehow, through some accounting trickery and corporate confusion, ended up on the option sheet for the 1969 Camaro. Only 69 were built. Each one cost more than 2 regular Camaros, and they were worth every penny. The ZL1 sounded different from iron big blocks. The aluminum construction gave it this metallic, almost tinny quality at idle. But don't mistake that for weakness. This was an engine that made over 500 horsepower when 300 was considered a lot. It had this razor-sharp exhaust note that cut through everything else. At a drag strip full of rumbling big blocks, you could always pick out the ZL1. It sounded expensive. It sounded exotic. It sounded like it didn't belong. What made the ZL1 special wasn't just the power, it was the delivery. This engine revved like a small block, but hit like a big block. It would spin to 7,000 RPM and sound happy doing it. The exhaust note would climb and climb, getting sharper and more violent with every 100 RPM. It was addictive. Drivers would rev it just to hear it. Consequences be damned. The ZL1 was so expensive and so rare that most people have never heard one in person. But those who have never forget it. It's the unicorn of American V8s. The engine that proves that when cost is no object, Detroit can build anything. The fact that it was basically a race engine that accidentally got sold to civilians makes it even better. This was never supposed to exist. But it did. And the world is a better, louder place for it. Which brings us to number 1, the Ford 427 SOHC, the Cammer, the engine that was too good for NASCAR. Literally, they banned it before it ever turned a wheel in competition. An engine so advanced, so powerful, so absolutely insane that even today, 50 years later, it remains the high watermark for American V8 engineering. The Cammer started life as Ford's answer to the Chrysler Hemi, but Ford being Ford, they couldn't just copy, they had to one-up. So they took their 427 FE big block and slapped overhead cams on it. Not overhead valves, overhead cams. With a timing chain that was 6 feet long, the result was an engine that made over 600 horsepower in race trim and sounded like mechanical thunder. The SOHC's sound was unique. The overhead cams gave it a different firing. Characteristic than push-rod engines, it was sharper, more precise. At idle, it had this nervous energy, like a racehorse in the starting gate. The mechanical noise from those chains and cams added another layer to the symphony. You could hear the engine working, all those moving parts singing in harmony, but crank up the revs, and the Cammer turned into something else entirely. It would spin to 7,000 RPM and beyond, screaming like a NASCAR engine, because that's exactly what it was designed to be. The exhaust note was clean and crisp at low RPM, but became this snarling, angry roar as the revs climbed. It didn't sound like a street engine because it wasn't. This was pure race technology, barely detuned for street use. Ford built about 750 Cammers, mostly for drag racing since NASCAR wouldn't let them play. Each one was basically hand-assembled, more race engine than production motor. They were expensive, temperamental, and absolutely glorious. The kind of engine that made no sense from a business perspective, but perfect sense from an engineering one. What really sets the Cammer apart is what it represented. This was Ford saying, we can build anything Chrysler can build, but better. It was engineering for engineering's sake. No committee decisions, no cost-benefit analysis, just pure what-if thinking turned into metal. The fact that it was banned from NASCAR just adds to the legend. Too good for competition. Think about that for a second. The sound of a properly tuned 427 SOHC is something that has to be experienced to be believed. It's violent but controlled, angry but precise. It sounds like what it is, the absolute peak of 1960s engine technology. No computers, no fuel injection, just mechanical genius and a complete disregard for practical limitations. You know what's interesting about this list? Half these engines were commercial failures. The AMC 401 couldn't save American motors. The Cadillac 500 arrived just as gas prices exploded. The 421 Superduty got banned. The ZL1 was too expensive. The Cammer got outlawed. But that's exactly what makes them special. These weren't engines designed by committees to meet sales targets. These were engineers showing off. And when engineers show off, we get mechanical art. The other thing you'll notice is that most of these engines are gone, killed by emissions, fuel economy, or changing tastes. The Voodoo and LS7 are the only modern engines on the list, and even they're discontinued now. We live in the age of turbocharging and direct injection. Efficiency over emotion. But here's the thing, nobody ever got goosebumps from a fuel economy rating. There's something primal about a good-sounding V8. It triggers something deep in our lizard brains. That sound means power, danger, speed. It's why people will pay extra for a louder exhaust, why they'll cold start their cars just to hear them bark to life, why videos of V8s at full throttle get millions of views. It's not rational, it's emotional. And that's exactly the point. Modern engines are better in every measurable way. More power, more efficiency, more reliability. A new Mustang GT makes more power than most of these legends and does it while getting 25 make the Mecre gras. But does it sound better? Does it stir the soul the same way? That's debatable. And that debate is what keeps us enthusiasts up at night. The truth is, we're living in the twilight of the V8 age. Electric motors are coming, and they're faster, more efficient, and better in every objective measure. But they're silent, and silence, no matter how fast it is, will never quicken your pulse like a 426 Hemi at full throttle. Never make you smile like a flat-plane Voodoo at 8,000 RPM. Never make you feel alive like a 427 Cammer unleashed. So what makes a great-sounding V8? It's not just volume, though that helps. It's not just tone, though that matters. It's character. It's personality. It's the ability to communicate mechanically what's happening inside that aluminum or iron block. The best-sounding engines tell a story with every combustion cycle. They announce their intentions. They broadcast their capabilities. They sing their songs of power and speed and barely controlled violence. These 10 engines did that better than any others America has produced. From the working-class hero AMC 401 to the blue-collar aristocrat Cadillac 500. From the high-strung Shelby 289 to the ground-pounding 454 LS6. Each had its own voice, its own character, its own way of turning gasoline into noise. Beautiful, antisocial, glorious noise. You want to know what the real tragedy is? Most people will never hear these engines in person. They'll watch YouTube videos with compressed audio through phone speakers. They'll read descriptions like this one and try to imagine what it sounded like. But words can't capture the chest-thumping bass of a 426 Hemi. Videos can't convey the spine-tingling shriek of a Voodoo at Redline. You had to be there. You had to feel it as much as hear it. I've been lucky enough to experience most of these engines firsthand. Standing behind a 427 SOHC at full throttle is a religious experience. Feeling a 454 LS6 idle through the floorboards is better than therapy. Hearing a ZL1 Camaro launch at a drag strip will recalibrate your understanding of violence. These aren't just engines, they're mechanical poetry. They're engineering emotion. They're the sound of American ambition turned into horsepower, and that's really what this list is about. Not just sound, but what that sound represents. The endless pursuit of more power, more speed, more everything. The belief that there's no problem that can't be solved with additional cubic inches. The very American idea that too much is just enough. These engines embodied that philosophy, and their sound was the proof. So the next time you hear a proper V8, really listen to it. Listen to the stories it tells. The compression ratio in the exhaust snap. The cam profile in the idle. Quality. The displacement in the depth of the tone. Every aspect of the sound is a decision some engineer made decades ago, a decision that prioritized emotion over efficiency, character over conformity, soul over spreadsheets. That's what we're losing as we move toward electrification, not just the sound, but what the sound represents, the mechanical honesty, the industrial poetry, the ability to hear exactly what's happening under the hood. Electric motors whine. They don't sing. They accelerate. But they don't accelerate with personality. They're faster, but they're not more fun. Maybe I'm just old-fashioned. Maybe I'm clinging to outdated technology like a boomer with a flip phone. But I don't think so. I think there's something fundamentally human about appreciating mechanical excellence. About celebrating engineering that appeals to emotion as much as intellect. About engines that sound as good as they perform. These 10 V8s did that better than any others. They were the best of the best. The engines that proved that horsepower isn't just about numbers. It's about experience. It's about emotion. It's about the sound that makes you turn your head, even when you're not a car person. The sound that makes kids point and adults smile. The sound that turns transportation into passion. That's the legacy of these engines. Not just the power they made or the cars they powered, but the emotions they created, the memories they forged, the dreams they inspired. Every kid who heard a 426 Hemi and decided to become a mechanic. Every engineer who heard a Cammer and thought, I can do better. Every enthusiast who heard any of these engines and fell in love with cars forever. So here's to the great American V8s, the ones that shook windows and set off car alarms, the ones that made dogs bark and babies cry, the ones that announced their presence 3 blocks away and left rubber on every street they touched. They were loud, obnoxious, inefficient, and absolutely perfect. They were the sound of freedom, power, and endless possibility. They were America on wheels, and they sounded exactly like it. The list could go on. The Boss 429, the Buick 455 Stage 1, the Oldsmobile W30, every manufacturer had their hero engine, their signature sound. But these 10, these are the ones that transcended their brands, the ones that became legends not just for what they did, but for how they sounded doing it. They're the engines that prove that sometimes, just sometimes, engineering and art are the same thing. And maybe that's the real lesson here, that the best machines, the ones we remember, the ones we love, aren't just functional, they're emotional. They have character, personality, soul. They make us feel something beyond the numbers on a spec sheet. These 10 engines did that through sound, through the primal, visceral, absolutely addictive sound of American V8 power. That sound is fading now, muffled by regulations, replaced by turbochargers, eventually, silenced by electricity. But for those of us who remember, who were there, who felt the ground shake and the air vibrate, that sound will never die. It lives on in memory, in YouTube videos played too loud, in the occasional car show where someone fires up something special. It lives on in the DNA of every performance car, even the quiet ones. Because once you've heard perfection, everything else is just noise. So crank up your speakers, find a video of a 427 SOHC at full throttle, close your eyes and imagine what it was like when these engines ruled the streets. When sound mattered as much as speed, when engines had personalities and cars had souls, when America built the best-sounding V8s the world had ever heard, and probably ever will.